Life for Gary Hobson had been quite difficult at times. You see, he got the newspaper a day early. He found himself trying to fix what was to go wrong every day, mostly with good success. He worked mostly alone, although he did have two friends that helped him with different problems at time. Although 90% of the time Gary worked out of Chicago, it was quite often that he had run into the hero Superman. He also was very familiar with Lois and Clark Kent, the two-star reporters from the Daily Planet. He had always been a fan of the two reporters' work and had been impressed with the intuitiveness that the two reporters had seemed to have. The information that Gary had access to from the early edition of the paper that he received on a daily basis had meant that he had to know how to keep things private. He worked hard at being an honorable man and had never made any profit from the news that he received. The information that he had access to was worth millions of dollars, and he lived a simple life with little money. There were times that he had tried to figure out more about his daily visitor, the cat, but had not been successful. It was as if the cat disappeared into thin air after he had delivered the paper. Once in a while the cat would hang around and allow him to pet him, but that was all. It was quite by accident that Gary had discovered some months before that Clark Kent and Superman were the same man. It was rather an accumulation of different hints that he had figured it out. Although he did not receive the Daily Planet early, he did receive the news a day early, and Superman was in the paper that he received nearly every day. He had been at a warehouse fire trying to save the people who would become trapped in the building, when he had arrived a little late. He had seen Superman that day go into the building and had managed to save many lives. Between Gary and Superman, some 30 people's lives had been saved that day, but the building had been destroyed. Gary had gone to thank Superman, but he had disappeared too quickly. He was standing there when he saw Clark Kent standing there looking at the results of the bad fire. The next day there was a large article in the Chicago Sun about the fire and Superman and how he had saved all those people in the building, but Clark Kent did not mention any of his first-hand knowledge in the Daily Planet. He and his wife Lois had covered the story, but there was no mention of Clark Kent being in Chicago. As a matter of fact, not 10 minutes after the warehouse fire, Mr. Kent had been photographed in Metropolis, his hometown. It had been at that moment that Gary was sure of Clark Kent's real identity. He would never tell anyone of his knowledge and would not mention it to him, unless the time came that it was absolutely necessary for him to seek out his help. After all, Superman was a very busy man himself, and most of the time Gary had been able to do his job without any help. Each day Gary would be met by a strange orange cat who would deliver tomorrow's newspaper. There were the horror stories of accidents, fires, accidental deaths and shootings that he had dedicated himself to stopping. But one day the newspaper told of a more consuming disaster. There was to be an attempt on the presidential nominee's life at a convention that was to be held the next day. Without Gary being successful, the woman that was to be the first lady president was going to be assassinated. Gary thought it over in his head over and over and knew that no matter what he and his friends did to stop this, the man was heavily armed and Gary and his friends would be in the most dangerous spot either one of them had ever been in. He had met danger firsthand several times before and was not really afraid to die. However, if they were not successful in stopping the assassination, history would be changed forever. That morning, as he sat with his two friends at the cafe, he went over the horrors that were to happen within the next 12 hours. His friends Chuck and Marisa listened intently to him on that morning. Chuck was always after the money angle, it seemed. However, Marisa was much more sensible and Gary had learned to trust her judgment exclusively. Marisa was blind and had a different way of looking at things sometimes. Have you ever thought about asking for some outside help? Do you think that if you approached a man like Superman that he would be more than willing to help you? He is always helping people and this is a big job, she told him. His friend looked up at Gary and shook his head in agreement. It was not a common thing for the two of them to agree. Different thoughts ran through his head over and over, but he knew that he was going to need the help of the Man of Steel. He looked up Lois and Clark Kent's home telephone number, but it was not listed, and to be honest, he didn't have the time to go through the hassle of finding the number anyways. So, it was decided that he would call Clark Kent at the office. He did not want to leave a message, as he knew that the secret that Clark Kent had was closely protected, and that he himself could be in danger if either Lois or Clark thought that Gary was going to expose them. Gary was pleased when Mr. Kent answered the phone. He explained to Clark that he was an investigator for the Chicago Sun and that it was of extreme importance that he get in contact with the superhero Superman as soon as possible. In fact, it was so urgent that he needed a contact with the man that morning if at all possible. "Sir, I am sorry, but there are times that it is impossible for me or anyone here at the Daily Planet to reach Superman. Superman is a very busy man and can be anywhere on the planet. He sometimes can disappear for days at a time," Clark told him. Now the last thing that Gary wanted to do was to tell this man his secret over the phone. This was a busy office and there was always the chance that someone would overhear what was being said. But it was necessary for Superman to come to Chicago right away. Gary could try to contact the government, but they already didn't believe half of his stories and he was well aware of the fact that he was on the list of questionable citizens, if there was one. "Sir, I have information on a plot to assassinate our Democratic candidate for president. It is important that I speak to Superman right away," Gary told him. "Have you tried contacting the CIA or someone?" Clark asked him. "I am afraid that I had been involved in some incidents that make the government untrusting of me," Gary told him. "But it is very important that I meet with him immediately." It seemed like a long time before Gary's phone rang, but within an hour, he received a call from the man that called himself Superman. It was on the phone that Gary and Superman agreed to meet at Gary's apartment in 15 minutes. Superman arrived on time and came through Gary's window. It was a little surprising to see a man in a cape come through your window when you live on the 11th floor. He came in and introduced himself and he and Gary took a seat on the couch. "I heard from my friend that you had information on an attempt on the life of one of the presidential candidates that is supposed to take place tomorrow. How do you know this information? What kind of source do you have? Do you know what time this is to happen, Mr. Hobson?" he asked. Gary knew that he was going to have to approach the man honestly. If anyone was going to believe his story about receiving tomorrow's newspaper, it was to be the man seated next to him. He looked the man right in the eye and began with his story. "Superman, I have a secret that I will protect at all costs. I know that you too have your secrets and it is my wish that you and I can work together when needed once you understand who I am and where I get my information," Gary told him. Superman looked at Gary intently and said, "What you say will stay with me and no one will know anything that is said in this room as long as it will not affect the security of the United States," he offered. Gary cleared his throat and got ready to tell the man of steel his secret. He had not told anyone of his newspaper except his two friends. He knew that he could trust this man, but still. "About 5 years ago, to my surprise, each and every morning I get my newspaper delivered by a cat. It is a regular newspaper, but there is one thing different about it. The newspaper that is delivered to me is for tomorrow's date," Gary told him. "For the past 5 years I have used the information that has been provided to me to save lives of the people that I can. I have dedicated my life to saving as many people as I can one day at a time." Superman looked at him and studied the young man. He looked quite honest, but his story was a story that was hard for anyone to believe. "Do you have a copy of the newspaper that you are concerned about?" he asked. Gary got up and got the newspaper. Once he handed the paper to Superman, the superhero looked through the paper at lightning speed. He thought for a second and said, "It appears that this paper is genuine, and it is tomorrow's paper. It tells of everything that will happen tomorrow just after midnight. If this is all true, I don't have much time," Superman told him with a sigh. The newspaper went on to say that a man would come from the shadows and without warning would shoot the lady from a very close range. Since part of running for the office of the President of the United States was going from person to person and shaking their hands, Superman was going to have his hands full. The paper from the next day did not who the assassin was, and unfortunately, by the time that the paper came out the next morning to Gary's house it would be too late. There were a few hints in the article. The man would come from the left and walk quickly into the room, fire his rifle twice, killing both the candidate and her bodyguard. He would disappear into what seemed thin air when all the confusion hit. Superman used his unique vision qualities and was able to get a better picture in his mind of the man who would do the shooting. One of Superman's biggest problems was that in his cape he stuck out like a sore thumb. Of course he could go as Clark Kent, however, If something happened, he could be exposed as the superhero he was in his other life. Gary had been studying Superman's face and decided that it was time for him to tell his new friend the whole truth. He needed to tell him that he had discovered his secret. He also needed to convince the Man of Steel that his secret was safe. Gary would never expose the man sitting next to him to anyone. That was a fact that could be assured. Superman, there is something else that you need to know. As I have told you, there is the fact that the newspaper always arrives a day early and that it is important for that secret to remain a secret, but with that secret I have learned another. Gary looked into the Man of Steel's eyes and told him, I know that in real life you are Clark Kent, the reporter for the Daily Planet. Superman turned and glared at Gary and said, that is something that I protect with my very being. Also, it is information that is very dangerous. There are very few people, even some of my closest friends, do not know the truth, he warned. It is the same with me, sir. If my secret was ever exposed to the wrong person, my life would be in danger at all times. I have access to many ways that people could make millions of dollars, and if the government ever found out what I could do, it would be all over. They would use me to change all kinds of things, and not all things would be for the good, unfortunately. Gary told him. I have called you to let you know what is going to happen today, because I need your help. Nothing will change unless you want it to. I have known your identity for quite a while now. Superman thought about it for a while. It was true, what this man had was a very dangerous piece of information, and with some work, they could make a very good team. He was sure that there were times that if he had known what was to happen on the day before it had happened, he would have been able to help many more people. It does seem that if we could work together on some different stories, it could be a good thing. There are times that there are volcanoes and floods in other parts of the world that I have been too late for, that I could now know of and perhaps prevent, he told him. Gary looked at the man who had come into the Earth's lives just about the same time that he had started to receive the newspaper and agreed. They could make a good team, and yes, there were times that he could have used this man. They could make a good team if they kept their senses about them. I am going to the convention headquarters now and take a look at the room in which the assassination attempt will occur. Perhaps I can find a place that I can hide from the general public. With any luck, the assassination will be stopped. I just have to check things out for now. Superman told him, and with that he was gone. The rest of the day Gary was busy stopping things from going wrong, as he had always done before. He saved the life of a young boy who was to have drowned at a local swimming pool. He stopped a man from robbing a bank, and ruining him and his family forever. He prevented car accidents and fights. All in all, the day had been a successful one, but he still was very worried about what was to happen just after midnight. Gary was just sitting down to his supper when his new friend Superman entered the apartment. Superman took a seat at the table with Gary and took a slice of bread. It was odd watching this superhero munching on a slice of bread and sitting next to him at his kitchen table. This was going to take some getting used to, he thought. I have done some investigating and have found a spot from which I can see the whole convention. With my speed and vision, it is my hope that the assassination will not be a success. Is it possible that you can be there also? Superman asked Gary. That evening Gary went with his new friend Superman to the convention and waited in the room where the assassination was to take place. Everything seemed to be going as planned. Superman was using his X-ray vision to watch the people who were attending, and saw nothing. Just as the paper had said, when the candidate had finished her speech, she headed to the back room. On either side of her she had Secret Service agents, and she looked safe, but she wasn't. The lady had taken but a few steps when Gary saw a man come from around the corner. He had just looked up when, like lightning, Superman was all over the man. He had him on the ground, and the rifle that had been hidden in his coat was on the ground. Without even realizing it, Gary had grabbed the weapon and had it aimed at the would-be assassin. Once again Mr. Hobson had been successful in saving someone's life. It had been with the help of a man who he would now call friend. They would make a good pair. Neither one of them would always be able to work together, but they both knew that between Gary's knowledge and Superman's powers they could do much more to help the people of the world by working together. Neither Gary or Superman had ever made a habit of hanging around once their job was done, and this case was no different. They both left with Superman scooping Gary up in his arms and flying out of the convention hall. Gary looked around the city in awe. He was mesmerized by the lights of the city, and once he had gotten used to the idea of flying without a plane, the flight was an adventure. His new friend took him all around the city, and as they watched the people below in silence, Gary was getting a better picture of the type of life that the Man of Steel was leading. After 2 hours, Superman took Gary back to his apartment and the two shook hands. They had become good friends that night, something that the two could use. As Superman headed back to his home, he thought of his wife. Will Gary someday share his secret with Lois? He would have to wait, but it would be the topic of discussion someday, he was sure.